All right, welcome back to the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. It's Monday, September 20th, and we are continuing our review of Thrive Montgomery 2050, the revised general plan for Montgomery County. And today we're working our way through the first two chapters, chapter 1 and 2. And we have a council memorandum that provide some comments for us to discuss, and that's what we're doing for today. And then we're going to take up the green building code. I'm going to guess that we will be not more than 2 hours on Thrive, and then a pretty quick, I think a pretty quick movement through the green building code. So we can get started. I'd like to just preface this by re-articulating that the Thrive Montgomery plan has gone through tremendous community review, and our planning department has conducted outreach touching thousands of residents with direct engagement and soliciting feedback, and surveys and community events. I remember participating in the Burtonsville, I think it might have been the kickoff of Thrive, actually, the Burtonsville event maybe 2 years ago, and there were hundreds of people there actually, and everybody who had the chance to draw, like participate in creating a mural about their vision for the area and the vision for the future of the county. And those kind of efforts really fit a theme and helped craft the themes of Thrive. And I know we're getting there's always going to be some criticism. I was somewhat relating to a comment that was made that you'll hear that there's criticism of the participation level until the participation level reflects the point of view of the person who is criticizing it. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on here. I think we had a pretty robust community engagement effort, but there's always a lot of issues that we're going to smooth out and work our way through. Of course, that's to be expected, as in anything. But this has been a very full and deep community engagement process. Despite the pandemic, we've had a lot of in-person and online engagement, and we have a document here, I think, that reflects that process. So just wanted to make that point. And again, just to kind of reiterate our calendar here, we are looking to have this committee complete its Thrive work by early October, first week or two of October, enabling us to send it on to the council and for the council to act on it by the end of the calendar year. Certainly anticipate there would be more than one session of the full council to kind of go through everything. But I think we're on track here thus far. So with that, if there are no comments from my colleagues, I'll turn it to Pam. We can welcome our participants and dive into it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start here in just a second. I want to do just a quick request to Yi Quinn to allow Chris McGovern into the meeting. He's with planning staff, and he may be required to show some of his mapping. So with that, thank you, everyone. This staff report today focuses on what we're calling the first and second chapters of the Thrive Montgomery plan. We had covered the introduction at our last work session, which was the last Fed committee work session in July. So we're starting off today. The next 6 chapters, 1 through 6, really are each topic area specific, and they include policies and practices to further,
I'm being told that the streaming for this meeting is a little bit mixed up. I'll let council IT staff know that some are saying that when you go to this on the website, you get the Public Safety Committee meeting, and when you go to the Public Safety meeting, you get this. So please take a note of that. We'll continue since it is being streamed, but sorry, Pam, didn't mean to interrupt you. Just need to alert our council IT staff about that. Please continue.
Sure. Okay, so as I was mentioning, each of the chapters 1 through 6 are topic areas specific, and they include policies and practices that really further the content of what is being discussed in the chapter. The first chapter today is called Compact Growth, and this is not a new concept to the general plan for Montgomery County. Compact growth was something, and corridor focused growth was something that the 93 refinement also encouraged and had policies that were aimed at. So that's not unique. The next chapter, just to give you some context, is complete communities. And the way the first 3 chapters of the Thrive Plan work are that they are nested together. So the first chapter, this compact growth chapter, really is about county-wide growth. Where do we see compact growth occurring? And we'll go through all that. The next chapter that we'll talk about today, the complete communities, is really at the neighborhood level. How do communities develop over time? And then the third chapter, which we'll discuss at the next work session, has to do with sort of the project level, the block, the building level of development. And then after that, we'll have further work sessions on transportation, housing, and parks and recreation. So just to also give a little context for people that are watching this or haven't been involved with it in the last couple of months, the planning department gave a presentation to the committee in mid-July in which they summarized their vision for Montgomery County in 2050. And the bullet points are on the second page of the staff report. And I think they're important to remind people that the vision as they describe it is to maintain a constrained growth area, to reintroduce East County corridors as a key to racial equity and economic competitiveness, to place an emphasis on east-west corridors with transit, to protect the agricultural reserve and make it more accessible and relevant to the whole county. And then last, to look for new ways to think about growth for using such things as parking lots to places, complete communities, and 15-minute living. So that's just sort of a summary of it, but I think it also helps encapsulate for people kind of what the purpose of some of these policies and practices are going to be aimed at. So with that, we turn, I'm on the third page of the staff report, to the compact growth corridor focused development chapter. And one of the primary things you'll see in this chapter is the 2050 growth map. And how the corridors, the growth areas and the centers are defined and where they're located. They establish this framework for the expectation for future growth. And during also the briefing that was done in July, the planning staff provided more definitions to some of these concepts and these things that were on the map, which are now, they're stated in the staff report and they will be included in the Thrive Montgomery plan. And I wanted to call them out for people that are following it so they can see what these definitions are and see if there's any questions, if there's any changes the committee wants to make to any of these. Council staff read through them and we feel comfortable with the definitions for the corridor focused growth area, the limited growth area, and the third area on the map is called the rural areas and agricultural reserve. I can read them all if you'd like, but they're also listed on page 3 in the staff report. Not seeing any questions, like the next set of oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, well, I don't have any issue with the definitions. I do think when we get to the maps, we ought to discuss, what these mean in the context of where they are and how that relates to some of the other maps and policies that we have. So I just wanted to note that now, but I don't know that we need to get bogged down specifically in the definitions themselves.
Yes, thank you. We will get to really discussing in detail what the maps look like about a little further on in the staff report. So for right now, thank you. These are the definitions. Following the definitions of the areas, you'll see that staff has also provided, oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was muted. I wanted to also add to that. I mean, the limited growth area definition says it's mainly suburban residential communities. There is variety within that. And, I think there are more rural communities within the limited growth area boundaries that we're seeing. So it's a little bit, we're looking at generalizations here and they don't, it's not a rule. We're not saying that they're all of the same type. I think we're saying largely, there are areas that consider themselves more rural that are seeing themselves in the limited growth area. And I just think it's important to note that if you're situated in the limited growth area, does not mean that we intend to, intensify it necessarily. It could be a more rural town center. And that's the way, I think, generally speaking, Thrive is sort of pushing against intensifying more rural settings. And so that's kind of one of the thrusts of the plan, really. But anyway, we'll probably, we'll discuss this topic more generally, I think, as we proceed. But it's not a uniform, there's no uniform issue there. It's a generality, and it doesn't necessarily speak to every example. Please continue.
Thank you. That was a good point. You'll also then see that there at the bottom of page 3 and onto page 4 of the staff report are the definitions for the different center types. There are large centers in the county. These are predominantly around the metro, some of our metro station policies, not all of the metro stations that we have. And also Viva White Oak. There are medium centers, small centers, and there are villages and neighborhood centers, which are really the smallest. These are the lowest intensity. They contain a small number of neighborhood serving uses and are located in rural areas and low density residential neighborhoods.
Right. A small center can be in a rural area, and
correct.
That doesn't mean that. So that is envisioned in the plan, that you will continue to have small centers in rural areas. Yeah.
Right, and planning can speak more to this. And I think that the whole premise of having the centers and going from like the largest to even the tiniest ones that can be within the county is that you'll have a whole chapter on complete communities that talk about just really trying to improve how these centers interact with the people that use them. It's not about increasing the size of the center necessarily. It's not about intensity of the centers as much as it is about making the centers a better place to do your shopping or visit a dog park possibly that's there, something that is an engagement with the community, even at the smallest of scales. That's not meant to intensify it.
I would just chime in. I think it'd be helpful for folks to understand. There's a lot of definitions here, a lot of terminology. I think there's not a lot of understanding of what each mean, but the difference between a small center, for instance, and a village and neighborhood, center, some even discussion here, but just examples of what an appropriate type of use would be in each of those is a full-size grocery store, something that's envisioned in a small center, but not in a village and neighborhood center, or is that envisioned everywhere? What are the type of, commercial uses that would be seen as appropriate for these particular areas? I think it would just be helpful for folks to understand. So I don't know if staff or if, planning could just quickly explain that. I think there's been a lot of questions, about that and kind of what is envisioned here. Because not just what exists today, it's about what we expect or would hope to see over the next 30 years. And that's at least what the plan is intended to do.
Well, the way I've been trying to explain this is you've all seen a Western where the good guy and the bad guy are coming into town for the showdown, to have a gunfight. And they'll come into the, small Western rural crossroads town, and there'll be a saloon, there'll be like a boarding house, there's a place to feed your horse, there's a church, that sort of thing, right? That's mixed use development at the smallest scale. Even a rural crossroads has a variety of uses that serve people's needs. And so the types of commercial uses that are appropriate in Darnestown or in Poolesville or in Ashton, those are primarily a difference in scale between those places and Bethesda or downtown Silver Spring or downtown Rockville. But it's really an emphasis on trying to make sure that there's a diversity of needs. So people who live in that area, they might not be able to walk to all those things, but they can come into the crossroads center, whether it's a village or a town or a more urban area, and meet as many of their needs as practicable without having to drive halfway across the county. So what the specific mix is needed is going to depend on the scale and the type of place and its proximity to other centers. But I think the short answer is it's all those things we think of as mixed uses. You want to have food, both prepared food and, you know, grocery stores. You want to have, you know, some recreational uses. You're going to have some gathering places for people to get together, both public and private spaces that are designed for people to, you know, gather in groups. You're probably going to have some limited kind of commercial space, if not office buildings, then maybe a medical building where there's some, you know, a doctor or a dentist's office or an accountant, those sort of things. So the precise mix will vary, but the point here is that the principle applies no matter what the scale is, and what's specifically needed in each place depends on the way it's developed up to this point. And the plan talks about some examples. Like for one of the examples the plan describes is Four Corners. Four Corners has Woodmore Shopping Center, which has a lot of those things. One of the things that Four Corners doesn't really have is great transit access. So getting transit access up and down Route 29 is really helpful to make Four Corners a more complete community. What the specific pieces are that are necessary in terms not just of uses, but public infrastructure and amenities is going to depend on the specific context and the specific place. Spaghetti Western or Midtown Manhattan and everything in between.
All right. Yeah, I think amen. Okay, Andrew, was that addressed your comment, your question? Okay, Pam, let's continue.
Okay, so I'm on page 4 of the staff report. We finished kind of having an overview of these definitions. And you know, one note in the staff report and for people to note is that the 2050 growth map identifies the growth areas, and it has a lot of the centers in the county on them. Obviously, the large centers, it's easy to place those on the map, but we do have several like village, very small centers, neighborhood centers. Not every one of them is on the map. And part of the rationale for not trying to put everything on the map is because we know that in the next 30 years, the county is going to change and grow. There could be new centers that we can't envision today. And so to give someone an expectation that the map includes everything that we think can ever happen in the next 30 years may not be accurate. And so it is to provide definitely the areas where we think the growth is important or should be focused, the quarter focused growth areas, where it's not as appropriate to change much, like the agricultural reserve, and then to provide the centers, and as many as possible or within reason, so that people get a sense of what does it mean? What kind of centers are village centers? What kind of centers are these medium centers? So I just wanted to give that context for the map. And then the next few pages really go through providing some maps that the planning staff provided to the committee in July as they talked about how they developed the plan. So they had more maps to show how do we actually get to the growth map that's in Thrive. We looked at something called an activity heat map. It's really a density of residents and jobs per square mile. And it really closely looks a lot like the areas that Thrive is putting forward. It looked at like, this is the county today, and it might evolve over the next 30 years to change and intensify. But you can see that if a map in 30 years is following sort of today's heat map, it's not expecting growth to occur in places that it's not anticipated today. The second map, one other point I wanted to make is not only is it a map showing the density of residents and jobs per square mile, but it was also very cognizant of where the special protection areas are in the county. And it has them as a cross-hatched area and worked to maintain that they are not in the corridor focused growth area, with one exception, which is Clarksburg, because the 10 Mile Creek area really is up there. That is an overlay that'll still impact that area and has certain regulations, but it is within that growth corridor for Clarksburg. The second map was that they took the the 1993 general plan refinement, and they overlaid it over zoning to see sort of how has the county evolved in the last 30 years? How does it compare our zoning changes to our master plans, what we had in 93? And there are some exceptions to that. There are some things that changed. So the new growth map is to take into account those gaps or those changes. One being that Olney is really a place where people are living and there are jobs out there. And so that became a place that was not sitting out in the rural and ag areas any longer. And then the third map was they took the proposed Thrive 2050 growth map and they overlaid it over zoning to really show how that did influence where they were drawing their corridors and the growth areas. And they match up fairly well. And then fourth, they overlaid the Thrive map over to the 1993 plan to see some of these differences on how this new map would look going forward. One, there are fewer areas, right? We have a ag reserve rural area, there's the corridor growth area, and then there's a limited growth area. It no longer has two different types of areas that are in between where we really think growth should occur and where we think growth shouldn't occur. But it does other things too. It introduces two new corridors, which I think are important to note. It does refine the agricultural and rural areas. It really did look at the zoning and those special protection areas to be a little more intensive about where those lines were drawn. And it really refines the I-270 corridor as well. So
It's an important map, Pam. I just want to say, I mean, it should go without saying, but it doesn't. The county has always planned to grow up through Rockville, Gaithersburg, Germantown, Clarksburg. And Clarksburg has been on the plan since the beginning. It's one of the corridor cities, almost the last of the corridor cities. And, I think there's sometimes confusion as though only like down county growth is, what this county has envisioned. And everything else was sort of pushing, exceeding the plan. It's not true, obviously, Gaithersburg, Germantown, Clarksburg, right in the sweet spot of what this county planned to accommodate the growth, to support the preservation of the ag reserve, all the area there that is bounded as rural agricultural is not zoned for growth. So, the ag reserve does not come down to 370, so I just make that point because I think there's confusion about what is sprawl and what isn't, what is planned growth and what isn't in this county. And, there tends to be, I think, a bias about that issue. I think you can fairly say it looks like Olney was not as thoroughly contemplated by the earlier planning. And so some change was made there some number of years ago. But again, right up to 270 corridor, Rockville, Gaithersburg, Germantown, Clarksburg, very much within the planned growth boundary to support increased population, increased job base, and to support the preservation of the ag reserve. Soapbox, okay? Keep going.
So the evolution of those maps brings us to the 2050 growth map that is in Thrive. On page 8, we do present the map that's in Thrive for people's context, but we have been meeting with planning staff over the last month and a half, and there were some slight changes that we talked to planning staff. They talked to us about noticing a few things on the map as well. So some slight changes to the map have been made. Some of the dots were reduced in size just so we could read the map a little more easily. You'll notice that the corridor for River Road was grayed out when it hit the Beltway. It's no longer showing as a corridor out to Potomac Village. We had received some testimony on that and just some other minor changes. I wanted to just bring that up because I want you, when you're talking about the growth map, we'll focus on the one that's on page 9 then. This has been the updated map that planning is providing to go into the document. And at this point, I think it'd be good for the committee to then, now that we've gone through to talk about the evolution of the map, we know what the definitions are, and to have the committee now weigh in on their thoughts. Are you as a committee supportive of the 3 different growth areas, the rural and ag reserve, the limited growth area, and the corridor focused growth area?
Okay, great. I'll kick us off. Generally speaking, yes. I think it's a simpler map. It's, an important qualification, which is this is not the growth map for Montgomery County. This is a largely complete, but not fully complete representation. And, there is language beneath this map that kind of qualifies it and says, not everything is on here. We just need to remind and keep that front and center, because we don't really, we don't like do our planning according to this map. It's like as though people might come out of this thinking, well, they take that map and then they go from there. This is a representation of everything that's beneath it, and look to everything that's beneath it to really understand what our intent here is. So let's hear from colleagues with comments on this topic. Andrew.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I think it's very confusing for residents. I've got to say that we have an overarching visionary document and a map that reflects what the document is intending for the strategic framework for growth in the county, but we're saying that it's not the growth map for Montgomery County. And I think that's just a very hard concept to articulate to residents. And I think that's a very hard thing, understandably, for folks to understand. Okay, well, what does this mean as an overarching visionary document? We all recognize that this is not an implementation document. This is a visionary document, but it is difficult. And I've raised before the challenge of not having consistency in our maps. I don't think we have to include everything in this map to the level of granular detail, because it is not a zoning document. It is a visionary document. But the zoning that we do should be consistent with this map. And this map should be consistent with the other maps that we have, whether it's the growth and infrastructure plan map or the other maps that we have, like related to the sewer envelope, and you name it. We have 6, 8, 9 different maps just that the county puts forward. Those maps should overlay with each other and be pretty seamless. I think they're close, but I don't think that they're the same. So that's what I would like to flesh out a little bit of what the rationale is of having a different map for the growth and infrastructure policy, which we just did, which reflects our policy priorities related to growth and related to transit-oriented development and related to reducing sprawl and all the same overarching goals that we have here, and a different map here, albeit not dramatically different, but to a certain extent it is different in certain areas.
We can pull up the growth and infrastructure map if you'd like. That's why we've asked Chris McGovern to be on this call. He's our GIS guru. I don't know if it would be helpful to do that. I do want to be clear that the map on page 9 is both a reflection of where growth, in a sense, has happened and is planned to happen through our current master plans. But it is also a framework for the future, in that we are saying we want to put our efforts into the focused growth area, the lightest blue color, and that is the area where we anticipate the majority of the new 200,000 people who are going to be coming to the county in the next 30 years. That's where we anticipate we're going to be accommodating the growth for those individuals. It is not to say, and again, we're trying to balance this, that there will never be a new house built in Damascus. It is not to say there will never be a new house built in Poolsville. But it is really saying that the majority of our future growth is going to be in the corridor focused growth area, that light blue area. The existing zoning does work very closely with this map. The areas in the darkest blue are rural zones. They are the agricultural zones, the 5-acre rural zones, the rural cluster zones. For the most part, the areas in the medium blue are RE1 and RE2, which are not rural zones. The RE stands for residential estate. It is for a type of suburban development that has larger lots, 1 and 2 acre lots. It does retain a nice sense of open space, but it was not intended to be rural in the sense of an area where you might have farming or other activities like agriculture. So, you know, when we say that the medium blue is mainly suburban, that is including residential estates in the 1 and 2 acre zones. But if it would be helpful, I don't know, Chris, are you able to share your screen and show the growth and infrastructure plan map?
Yeah, I just pulled that in, so let me share my screen. Share. Okay. Hi, everybody. So, are you seeing this blue county map here right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the tiers made transparent, so we could see it on top of these other areas. So here is the these are Lisa Gavoni's layers that she worked on with Jason Sartori for the growth and infrastructure policy. So here you can see the two of them overlaid. And now there's two versions of this. There's the school impact areas and as well as this policy area map. But I'll just do this one first and then we'll look at the other one. I believe that generally speaking, you have all of these, the red areas are within our inner core. And if you like, I can go to the other one or zoom in on something. I'll go to the school impact map. So you can see the infill areas are also all within our core, our growth focus area, and with the exception of the green field up in Clarksville.
Which was something you all actually, I think when we went through the growth and infrastructure policy, we talked about having a greenfield area, and I think the council did not agree with that.
But I think
All council members, I will note, but yes, that is accurate.
I think what this shows is that these maps, while they do align with each other reasonably closely, they were all developed with slightly different purposes in mind. You know, the school one is the most notable, and it's sort of like it's just considering factors that are not really about so much intensity of growth, but when was the green field sort of, you know, in the rearview mirror. Even on the transportation side, though, the character of a particular plan area for transportation purposes is related to the zoning, land use intensity, all those sort of things, but it also is influenced by other factors, including what kind of transportation infrastructure is there and travel behavior, which is a product not just of the land use and infrastructure, but also things like household income. So, or proximity to jobs, things like that. I see Glenn wants to add something.
Yeah, if I could, just following along with what Casey was saying, there's actually the reason why the maps for the policy areas, for example, don't match up with Thrive's exactly. There's a pretty good correlation, but not perfect. Is they have two different time frames. Thrive's looking at the very long term. It's looking at 2050 and saying where will the transportation be, the transit will be, and the density will be as a guide for future plans going up to 2050. the growth and infrastructure policy really only goes out in terms of transportation, at least only about 10 years. And it takes into account projects which are already programmed. So for example, let's take Olney. Olney right now, there is no heavy transit that is programmed to go to Olney. However, there is a master plan, Maryland 355 BRT, which will go to Olney. And so it makes sense now for the that policy area to have a sort of a lesser threshold for, or a higher threshold for congestion or whatever than ones further south where there's more transit. But once the BRT is actually planned and more importantly programmed up that way, there is the ability to be able to say, okay, now Olney is ready to have its status changed in the growth and infrastructure policy. This is something we've done really for the last 30, 40 years. Clarksburg, for example, had a lower standard, Germantown had a lower standard for a long time until there was more express service provided to Germantown along I-270. It's not a transway exactly, but sort of is. And so I think that's one reason why there doesn't need to be an exact correlation or even necessarily that close a correlation between the policy area status, if you will, of an area and what's in Thrive.
I appreciate that. And I think, I get where you're coming from with that. I think the challenge here is, there's some concern that, part of the Thrive map is reducing or eliminating some of the existing rural or things that appear more rural areas that are, perhaps outside of the agricultural reserve, slightly outside the agricultural reserve. We do have areas that have more of a rural context currently that are outside the agricultural reserve. We all share the goal, and I believe this plan does a very good job of, focusing on, intensity of development in corridors, in areas that we think have been appropriate. That's, frankly, consistent with what the plan for Montgomery County and growth has always been, as Chair Reamer noted in the beginning. I mean, much of this is refinement and not, dramatically new, although we are adding, corridors, particularly in the east part of the county that, I believe should have been there all along. And I think have, had unfortunate consequences as a result. But it does beg the question from what you're suggesting of whether or not the way that this map is written, that some of those areas, the goal, that there is a goal of creating higher intensity of transportation or of development. I'm not sure that's the case. I don't believe that that is the intention, but I think that is, a bit of the disconnect here that exists that I think we could refine a little bit better related to the fact that, is it the fact that the growth and infrastructure policy and the transportation network has not caught up because the growth isn't 30 years from now, it's today's growth and maybe 10 years of transportation planning in order to meet that growth and where are we on that timeline? Or is it this diverges from the direction that that's heading? Because if it's just a question of timing and catching up, that's different, but it doesn't appear in all the cases that is the reason why the maps are slightly different. And that's, there's testimony from Darnestown that was reflected in the packet. And I think that is the point, at least, that they were trying to raise. I think it's important for us to flesh out.
Yeah, and on this map that we have in front of us, where you see the yellow area with the number 7, and then the green area next to it, those are all within the medium blue. Those areas are all pretty much zoned the same. They're pretty much all RE1 and RE2. There are 2 different planning areas. There is the Potomac planning area and there is a Darnestown planning area. And I think that some of the growth and infrastructure policy differentiation between the yellow and the green was a separation of some of the master plan boundary areas. But in reality, that whole area that has both yellow and green, that is that whole sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, kidney-shaped kind of shape, is all being treated the same way from a Thrive standpoint. It is being viewed as an area that is very limited growth. The growth that the centers that do exist fall into the villages and neighborhood center category. Number 7, I believe, is Potomac Village. And number 5 is Darnestown. Those are frankly considered villages, although both of them have full-size grocery stores in them. In fact, Potomac Village has more than one full-size grocery store. And they do have a number of existing amenities. They're actually, a bit big for village centers if you compare them to Sandy Spring or Ashton or some of the other village centers.
I was gonna, not to interrupt you, Gwen, but I was gonna mention that key issue of, I think a grocery store is a good reflection of the development level in an area. And the more rural ones are too rural, frankly, to support a large grocery store. But those ones that you just mentioned can support them. And they are a little bit more intense.
I tried to raise that earlier to come up with something tangible and understandable for residents. And I do think a grocery store is something that everybody can understand. So I appreciate the comment. I still do think, I mean, we have transportation dynamics. I don't think that those transportation dynamics are necessarily intended to change here. And there's a difference between the yellow and the green policy areas in terms of the type of density and growth. And so it is hard to follow why in one policy document we see those as different, but in Thrive we see those as the same. And I'm not sure I have fully understood that, and I have a good ability to be able to express to residents why it's differentiated in one but not in the other. So perhaps Gwen, you could help us with that, or Casey, to understand the difference.
Yeah, I think maybe we could give some thought to how this is articulated. I do believe that this area around Darnestown illustrates how there's, this is an area of the county which is certainly, it's not rural in the same sense that the area further to the west and north is rural, but it's also less sort of suburbanized than the area to the east and the south. So there's a little bit of a, it's kind of on the edge there between two kind of land use patterns, and these things don't lend themselves to like a sharp division. But I think that there's probably a way we could think of articulating, why it is, for example, the presence of the idea of like graying out River Road once it gets past Potomac Village, I think is a useful sort of illustration of the point that, River Road as a transportation corridor has a little bit different function and character once you get further south than it is when you go further out towards, the edge of the county. And similarly, these planning areas and the GET map reflect the fact that Potomac has a slightly different land use context, just a shade, perhaps more suburbanized than what you might think of as Darnestown. Not that they're very far different, but just there's certainly, I think reasonable people could look at Darnestown versus Potomac as not being identical, but just being very close.
So we'll take a look at why the growth and infrastructure policy map had Darnestown as green and Potomac as yellow, and get back to you on that. Because honestly, I do not remember exactly why the growth and infrastructure policy made that distinction. But the reality is that entire area is zoned the same. It has development. I mean, I think, again, we can't really see it exactly, but because the map is general, but Quince Orchard is in that general vicinity, which again is an area that has a lot of services. You know, it is a Darnestown itself. You know, if we want to have a conversation about it, is a rural village, but it has a lot of facilities that you find in a larger center, like a full-size grocery store. We still think it should be identified as a rural village because we do think that the character of Darnestown and Potomac is still less dense and if not literally rural in the sense of agriculture and that type of use, it does have a sense of large lots and of open space. But we don't really see why Darnestown should be treated differently than Potomac.
Well, I appreciate that. I just think it needs to be fleshed out a little bit, and I don't want to take too much more time because I'm not sure we're going to quite flesh it out exactly here. I do think it would be helpful as you look at the growth and infrastructure map to also look at the sewer map as an overlay and, you know, kind of look at all three of those because it is all related to the type of intensity of development, the context of the land use and the type of land use pattern there. So I just think they should all be taken in appropriate context and then, you know, determine if there's any refinement there. Again, I think it's very important to the community that it impacts on in the scheme of the broader growth or Thrive, you know, policy document. I think that this is, more of a conversation about refinements and clarifications. I don't want to get too bogged down on that. I think there's an absolute goal in all of the policy priorities that were shared in the beginning, particularly reducing sprawl development, advancing environmental, economic development, and equity. I think we're all in that same goal. I just think that this is an area with relation to these different maps, including the sewer and the growth and infrastructure, that we could just look at, you know, potential for refinement. I did, if we could switch gears on this, since it was raised, this question of the corridors and River Road. I just want to ask a couple questions about that. I'm just interested in hearing about the decisions related to River Road as a corridor. I mean, I understand, and I'm not sure that there's much of a change in overall policy and how this will be treated, since where it is now terminating is within the urban ring. But this seems like the only corridor that we have that doesn't have a plan for transit currently, does not connect activity centers to one another. We don't envision new significant activity centers, you know, or municipalities to be created. So I'm just curious as to, you know, what the thought process is behind specifically designated River Road up to the Beltway now, and why that is selected instead of, for instance, like Old Georgetown Road, which would connect Bethesda and the Pike District, or we have others that have been selected, like Connecticut Avenue, which connects Chevy Chase Lake, Kensington, Wheaton, you know, which are significant activity centers, or obviously what we talked about before with Route 29 and others. So I'm just wondering if we could
Sure.
get an explanation on that.
You know, I think that River Road is an important state highway in Montgomery County. It does have quite a few activities on the southern end of it, including, you know, grocery stores and retail and schools and other kinds of uses. It is actually an important connection to the Beltway and ultimately to the American Legion Bridge. I think that somewhere in the next 30 years, we may talk about if it's an important connection to getting us to the American Legion Bridge. We aren't talking about that right now. We don't know that that's the case right now, but I think that it is it is an important connection, and an important connection, again, to the Beltway and to the American Legion Bridge.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me. I mean, we're connecting, there's no real activity centers that are being connected, and we're connecting not to transit, but to the Beltway. And we hope that the Beltway will ultimately have transit as a significant component of it, but it doesn't today. So just, I mean, that is a different corridor than any of the other corridors, which
I think
it just seems quite different, and it's already in the urban ring. So there's no land use pattern that I can understand that would be different by designating it a corridor. So I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah,
We had, I'm sorry.
I was going to say Connecticut Avenue is another one that doesn't have BRT.
Yeah, but it connects activity centers.
Connects some important activity centers.
Yeah, but there are no activity centers on River. That was the point that I was making. Either envisioned for transit or connecting existing activity centers or planned activity centers. Connecticut Avenue, you have Chevy Chase Lake, you have Kensington, you have Wheaton. I mean, that is a major corridor of significant activity centers. River Road does not, inside the Beltway, you have Westbard and Bethesda, but inside the Beltway, beyond that, there's no real activity center.
Yeah, one of the issues here, we had a very vibrant discussion amongst council staff about all this. And for example, in the case for putting River Road in, at least inside the Beltway, is that again, the centers that show up on this map are representative. They're not all of them. And I think one would argue that Westbard is at least a smaller center, even though it's not identified here. Friendship, it also goes to Friendship Heights, which is a large center. Alternatively, you can make the argument that really if there's supposed to be a tie between enhanced transit and where these centers are, particularly the medium and high, medium and large, then not only would you not include River Road inside the Beltway, but you would not include Connecticut Avenue, and you would not include University Boulevard between Wheaton and Kensington, because none of them have master plan BRT. In fact, Connecticut Avenue was looked at by the planning board back in 2012, 2013 as a possibility for BRT and rejected it because the amount of land use that was along that route and the ridership that was forecast for Connecticut Avenue did not measure up to being worth having a BRT on it.
Yeah, I'm suggesting
I know you're not suggesting that. I'm just saying the argument's both ways. What we have here is sort of a some are included, some are not. It isn't consistent in that respect. But it's kind of where we are in terms of at least what council staff consensus seems to be, even though it doesn't match up to, again, where the BRTs are.
Yeah, every other connection, the point that I was making is in most cases they're planned for transit, either have existing or a plan for transit. In all other cases, they connect significant activity centers, existing and planned activity centers. In this case, it's connecting to the Beltway, which I don't think any of us envision ever being an activity center. It may be a place that connects transit at some point, but we don't envision the Beltway being a major major area for new development at the River Road entrance. So I mean that, and the Westbard and the Friendship Heights and the Bethesda piece, that has always been envisioned of Westbard, Bethesda, and Friendship Heights, at least that I'm aware of. It's never been envisioned, Westbard out, west, out, going away from the urban core. It's been that Westbard connects to the urban core with bus. That has always been, what the land use pattern and thought process was there. I'm just raising the, question of consistency here and the decision between this and, say, as I mentioned before, Old Georgetown Road or some other place. It's just not clear to me why this is selected and not another one, and what the real connection is.
So I think the center is not necessarily within the boundaries of Montgomery County. Northern Virginia is an important center or destination. At some point, getting across the American Legion Bridge for people in the down county may involve some form of transit along River Road. That's a long range idea. It is not something, I don't want to start scaring the residents of that area. It is a long-term idea that as part of a network, it is an important connection to get to the Beltway and to the American Legion Bridge.
Okay.
It connects a lot of important parts of the down county.
Councilmember Jawando has a question, comment. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you. Were you done speaking, Gwen? I don't want to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I think to the question of, are these the right general, areas? I think the answer is yes. Obviously, a lot of variation, between the types here. So, village Colesville, where I used to live, versus village, Ashton are different. Those are different sizes and scope and scale. And to the discussion we were just having, I think on the eastern side of the county too, there are areas that within 30 years, as you head up New Hampshire Avenue, as the BRT is built out, that, I think while our limited growth area now, and kind of you have that dip in the appropriate focus on Burtonsville and the far eastern side, I think the flexibility in the changing dynamic of what limited growth will mean or could mean will be, that's going to change. And so I think there's no perfect way to do this. I think that the discussion we were just having is, indicative of that. But I do think generally this is the right set of categories and descriptions. I know we'll get to in a second. I'll just say it now in case I don't get to chime back in immediately, that overlaying the transportation infrastructure as council staff recommends, I think, or at least as I understand the recommendation, but considering medium and large centers in relationship to transit, I think is an important point. And I just mentioned an example of that in the case of planned BRT routes. So that would be, I think, an appropriate addition. But I think otherwise, I think this is, we're in the right direction. And to our public, the millions watching at home, it's good that there is a lot of synergy between the maps. If we can get it even closer, that would be good as well. So.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is, first of all, the transportation lines on the map here are somewhat relative to their surroundings in their importance. And I think that's kind of what Gwen was saying, is that while River may not be the same as, another major corridor in its intensity, it is the vital link for that part of the county. And so that's why it's drawn, if I'm understanding correctly. I wanted to ask about the Quarter Cities Transitway corridor. We have the purple line drawn quite clearly, and we don't have the Quarter Cities Transitway corridor drawn. I know that, well, anyway, we don't have that drawn. So I wanted to ask, I'll start with Pam, comments here on potential transit routes, BRT alignments have been mentioned. How does this all fit together? And don't we have some substantial planned development along that corridor, that's proceeding and merits a visual representation?
Yeah, thank you. I would say, and that's something that I missed. I had thought that through when I was working on the staff report, and I just lost it when I was writing it, and I apologize for that. But I do think that given that the CCT is currently a transit route that's been in several master plans, it is something that is in the works in the county. It should appear on this map. But I will again reiterate that what we know is that the general plan map is amended by future master plans. And so if a future transit plan removes it, then that is not a problem. It doesn't have to be in conflict just because it's added today, but it today makes sense that we add what we have as existing and planned as far as transit goes. And that also goes in the other direction that, you know, if we we have something here that we're not thinking of today that becomes a transit route, then again, that also gets amended in a future transit plan. And while it may not show up on the map today, it would show up in the future. So I think it's just thinking through that, you know, this map is about what we expect or would like to see in 2050. It is not 100% what is going to happen in 2050. But we do know that the rationale for drawing it today is that it's existing in planned transit. So I believe the CCT should go on there.
And we agree. I think that what is shown up here is the CCT master plan route, yeah, that Chris just added in the sort of moss green color. And it's all within the corridor focused growth area, but just literally showing it on the map is fine. We can absolutely do that.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so to kind of summarize, there's a fair amount of variety within some of these areas, and you know we need to communicate that in the representation of the map, and so that people don't overinterpret what this means. We spent a lot of time talking about the Darnestown question today, as they have been concerned about their identification here. And what I heard you say really was that your representation for the future of Darnestown is actually almost in a way less than what it is today. And I think that sort of demonstrates your vision for Thrive as it relates to Darnestown, which is that it is not generally seeking to intensify that part of the county, quite the opposite. And that's why it's shown as a center on the scale of Ashton, when in fact it's quite less. I mean, it's quite more. So, you know, I think that, again, I think that kind of demonstrates the philosophy here and what you're trying, you know, what your ambition is for that area. So let's, without further ado, we can continue here.
Okay. So I'm just going to check in with the committee here. What I'm hearing from the committee members is you are in agreement with the 3 different designated areas, quarter focused growth, limited growth, and the ag reserve and rural areas. And you're also comfortable with having 4 different types of centers defined as presented in the staff report, although there was the recommendation made to reference proximity to transit for the large and medium centers. That reference doesn't have to be within a certain distance, because I think that might be too prescriptive, but just to reference that large and medium centers do have proximity to high quality transit. That gets back to this idea that they help form these corridor focused areas. And I just wanted to double check in with the committee with the centers that are on the map. If there's any that you feel interested in adding that were missed. We had talked just a little bit ago about Westbard.
Yeah.
Adding it, but that's, anyway, just wanted to ask that question before we move forward.
Well, now that you said it, I think Westbard, you know,
Yeah.
could be on the list. I mean, there's no reason for it not to be. It's just, again, we haven't got them all in here, and not being on here doesn't mean you are or are not a center. I mean, it probably means you're not a center, but it doesn't mean if you're there now, you're not going to be there in the future.
I'd be
Any
fine
others?
adding it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think West Bard and Friendship Heights, I think you can include both of them, or both.
I believe Friendship Heights is there as a large
Oh,
center.
I see it as red.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we were
I
talking
scrolled
about
past
adding,
it. I scrolled
Yeah.
past it in my, now I see it. Yeah.
I, if I'm correct, Glenn, did you mention adding Westport as a small center?
Yes. Because it doesn't meet the category of the definition of village and neighborhood, which has to be, either a low density area or rural area. So the
Right.
smallest it could be would be a smaller center. But there's actually a few others that we identified as probably other smaller centers, but we didn't put it in the staff report because, again, the idea was these are representative and not considered to be the full range of what there would be. For example, Chevy Chase Lake certainly would be a small center. Long Branch would be a small center.
Now, I think if we add too many dots, the
And that's
map
the problem. Yeah, the question is how many dots you want to add.
unreadable and becomes less useful. I think adding Westport as a small center is great. I just would caution you from sort of adding every different community in the county because it all starts to blur together.
I understood. I think, more of an explanation under this map is helpful, like you got in the sentence that it's not exhaustive, I would say that a couple times.
We could do that.
Yeah, the key is making sure that the public in that area understands that even if it's not designated as a small center, it might be treated as a small center or medium center, depending on what it is.
And just to answer the question earlier about, moving forward with the definitions as they exist, I agree, but I do think that, having the refinement, as we talked about earlier, and an additional look at the map to address the concern that's been raised about potential shrinking of the existing rural areas and, overlaying it with sewer growth and infrastructure policy, just to make sure that it's as consistent as possible and reflects the overarching goals, I think would be helpful.
We can take a look at that. I do want to be, just to be on the record, be very, very, very clear. We have not shrunk any rural areas. Everything that is zoned rural and agricultural reserve is in the dark blue. We have not shrunk anything that is truly rural. The areas in the light blue are a different kind of zone, which is a large lot residential estate. And many people who live there feel like they are in a rural area, but it is not an area that is really zoned as a rural area for farming and for those kinds of activities. They are large lot residential estates. And the whole area of Darnestown is zoned pretty much the same as the area of Potomac, which is all in that kidney-shaped light blue area on the left-hand side of the map. So I just want to put it on the record. We have not reduced any of the rural areas.
It would just be helpful, I think, to get like a definition of how we're defining rural, because we've used the term rural, we've used the term agricultural. I think sometimes we use them interchangeably. I think they mean different things sometimes to different people. I think, Gwen, you're right in that sense. And so I think it'd just be helpful if we were more explicit about what rural area means, perhaps.
We can do that.
And there's guidance in the zoning ordinance that helps us with that, and we can certainly reference that.
Yeah, I think referencing it as part of this would be helpful. I think it would alleviate some of the concerns, because I think you're right. But I think, the goal here is also to alleviate the concerns and be as explicit as possible in something that is not an implementation document. So it's hard to be absolutely explicit because we're not implementing, we're providing guidance. Thanks.
Okay. That was a very well said, clear statement there, Gwen, as well. Thank you. Okay, continuing.
So I'm pretty sure this moves us off the map conversation we've covered. I think the relative definitions, the designations, the numbers, the representation of the different things and how they're framed, which I think would bring us to page 11 in the staff report, which is about the policies and practices that the Thrive Montgomery puts forward to establish this vision in the future of compact corridor focused development. And I've listed them on pages 11 and 12 of the staff report.
Pam, should I stop sharing my screen now?
I think you can. Is the committee okay with that?
Yeah,
I could bring it back if anybody needs it.
thanks.
Thank you, Chris. So that brings us to pages 11 and 12 in the staff report. The first policy was to concentrate growth activity and along corridors through compact infill development and redevelopment to maximize the efficient use of land. The next was to promote and prioritize public investment in infrastructure along the growth corridors and to leverage it to attract future private investment in a compact form. Under each of these, there are several practices. The practices have been noted with an icon that shows whether they support economic health, environmental resilience, or racial equity and social justice. Those are the three overarching objectives. And so what came out of some of that review that we've been doing with the planning board and planning staff in July was that they would indicate to the public and to people what how those objectives were being supported with their policies and practices. So that's what you're seeing also on pages 11 and 12 as it relates to what's being put forward. Under
Just going to ask, so you have these indicators, for those three things. Does that mean that they will be an explanation of that, or your
so it follows
notation?
it follows this section. So you have these policies and practices we note where they support those objectives. The next section is a section for each of those overarching objectives. There's a section that is really about how these policies and practices in text talks about how they support economic health, racial equity and social justice, and environmental resilience. So that does include, that's in the chapter as well. It's just follow these policies.
Yeah, just to reinforce what Pam is saying is we actually took to heart very much the committee's direction to really show how the three main framework ideas are in every chapter of the document. And so we're doing that in two different ways. We're putting these little symbols next to each of the policy and practice recommendations to show which of the framework goals they relate to. But then we've actually added a section in every chapter that says, how does this chapter support economic health? How does this chapter support community equity? How does this chapter support environmental sustainability? So we literally have that in every chapter, and this is going to be carried through in all the chapters you see.
Great. I think that's very helpful. Thank you.
If there's no questions or comments on the first two policies and their subsequent practices, if you look at the third policy, which is to limit growth beyond the corridors, to compact infill development and redevelopment and complete communities to prevent sprawl, apply principles of urbanism at an appropriate scale along a rural to urban transect as outlined in the complete communities chapter. And it talks about how to really manage land outside the corridors. This is about protecting watersheds, improving water quality, expanding opportunities for recreation. But we had also received comments from the Department of Environmental Protection in the county requesting that this could possibly be expanded a little further to not only talk about the ways in which the natural environment is protected and enhanced, but also ways in which we support clean energy and distributed energy, and to better facilitate what are called circular economies, where we are being more protective of the environment through these actions. So you'll see in the staff report on page 12 is a recommended practice that will, as the bullet, could be added underneath this policy.
I like it.
Committee's okay with that? Okay. And then the fourth policy is to preserve and enhance the agricultural reserve and maintain it and manage it to maintain a rural pattern of development for the benefit of the entire county. There are two practices that follow. But again, the council received letters from the Office of Agriculture, the Ag Preservation Board, and the Ag Advisory Committee, requesting that some of the information that had been contained either in earlier general plans or in the public hearing draft. And one thing in particular, while it is mentioned on page 39 of the plan, to solidify it as a practice, to call out that the primary use in the agricultural reserve is agriculture. And that's what this recommended bullet does at the bottom of page 12.
I know that'll be appreciated. I know our friends in the Ag Reserve are, a little concerned, and there are a number of important issue areas where the draft that we received, made some changes, and there's in the chapter now, there's emphasis and interweaving. And so this is one of those where, that was the result of that approach. And I don't think that it changes anything as far as the policy that we're pursuing, but it did make people feel a little bit differently about it. So I think this language is helpful, and I think espouses what we all know is our objective with the agricultural reserve.
Yeah, I appreciate the addition here, and I would just say, I think to many it goes without saying of what the primary purpose of the agricultural reserve is, but I think it helps to be said sometimes. And so I think this is helpful. I think that this is inclusive of all that the agricultural reserve can and should be. It's about the entire county, the benefit of the entire county, reduction of sprawl. It's about food sources, about economic opportunities. I mean, we have done a lot with the agricultural reserve. It has changed, and yet it has remained true to what it was intended for the broader policy priorities that it has. And I think these 3 bullets now do a good job of reflecting that. And I agree with you, Chair Reamer, that it's really an enhancement and a kind of a fine point on what was already intended. But I think it goes without saying, but helps to be said.
Those things that go without saying probably need to be said.
I agree, and we'll say it since they go without saying.
Exactly. All right.
Okay. As we proceed forward, then the next section is the one that Director Wright mentioned. It really is a section that separates out, talks about how the policies and practices support economic health, racial equity, and social justice, environmental resilience. This has been a part of the draft that came about after meeting in July that planning staff worked on, and council staff supports these sections. And if there's no questions, the last section in each chapter will be metrics, and this is new to this general plan. Prior general plans did not have this. This is an innovative piece that the planning department's adding, which are things that they are recommending become measures that get looked at over time, so that planning and the council understand how well what they're working on from year to year is good policy and working toward implementing the plan. This will probably be, while the metrics will be in each chapter, I think there will also be a section where we talk about implementation, and there might want to be some timeframes for consideration of looking at these metrics, possibly mentioned in the plan, like every 3 years, every 5 years, just listing the metrics, but no plan for when they get looked at. I think it would be better for the plan to at least mention what the expectation is for evaluating how well it's doing. And then last are the actions. Again, these are not actually in the chapter. You'll notice there's an appendix called Action List of Resources. And it's quite long. For chapter 1, there's 31 actions. It's a lot. And what the planning staff also mentioned were, some of these really should be envisioned as very short term. Let's, jumpstart the process for the general plan. There are others that are medium term and some that are long term. This is something that the council can come back, the committee can come back and look at once the general plan is adopted. It can take up looking at the appendix. and go through and have conversations about those actions and the time frame for those actions. It's not predicated on approving the plan right now. So given how much you have to review, I would suggest that you come back to that after the plan's approved.
Okay. We can do that. All right, so you're just on page 13 here, right, Pam? Or are you?
Just covered the bottom of page 13 with the conversation related to actions.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Okay. And with that, we can turn the page to 14 and we can start to cover chapter 2. And this is the complete communities chapter, and it's talking, complete communities are really, as they phrase it, a mix of uses and forms. And again, complete communities are not completely new to the general plan either. But again, in this version of a general plan and Thrive, it's really about how do we refine this idea of a complete community or a center in a way that's more purposeful than has been done in the past, so that we actually achieve some of the centers we'd like to see. If you, one thing that I noted when I was reading through a lot of the correspondence that's come into council, and I mentioned it in the staff report, and I think it's just worth mentioning, is that, there's a lot of correspondence that comes in that's kind of concerned about Thrive, but it's also concerned about, the direction that the attainable housing study, where that might go. All of these things remain to be seen. The housing study is currently still a study. It's under review with the planning board. And I think that it's important to note that, Thrive is a policy document. It does not change zoning. It's not about that. And complete communities aren't about having a complete community across the entire county too. I think there's some angst about what these complete communities meant, that they simply meant more development, and they certainly do not. The plan actually does a really good job of talking about how to think about these communities in context. So like we've been talking all morning about Darnestown being a crossroads with some retail. Having a complete community there doesn't mean increasing the footprint of that crossroads, but it might make for better parking in relationship to the way people get in and out of that center, or can they bike there more easily? Or, is there a place to have a cup of coffee outside there? Things like that. So with that, if you're on page 15, you'll notice that there's 2 paragraphs that planning staff have proposed to add back into the plan that kind of get at this conversation of how can we make sure that as someone is reading Thrive, they understand that this isn't meant for just the centers that are located in very dense areas. It's about a center anywhere, but that center anywhere isn't going to be the same size everywhere. That the center that's in a rural location is necessarily, could be small, but as a complete community in that location means something different, and that's important. And I think too, this also gets, just to frame it, it gets at this idea, we also received correspondence, people concerned that 15-minute living and introducing that concept and talking about it meant that the plan was advocating that everywhere in the county should have 15-minute living. And there are certain places that we know, certainly in the agricultural reserve, in our rural areas, even in our residential estate areas where people have 2 and 3, acre lots. They're probably not going to be a 15-minute walk, or maybe even a 15-minute bike ride from some of these things. They might be a drive away from it, but even at that, the idea, and I think Chair Anderson mentioned it earlier, is like if we can get people closer to these things, even if they're not biking or walking to them, we're still helping. Because if they're driving a shorter distance, then we've made an impact. And once they get there, you want to have a community center, even if it's small, to have all the different things you can possibly have and as many amenities as possible. So that's really what the second chapter is about. It also, when you turn to 16, it lays out policies and procedures to get at this. Council staff reviewed them all and didn't have any recommended changes to any of them.
Before we get too far down, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just wanted to see if I could speak to the complete communities 15-minute living question, and then the 2 paragraphs and what seems to attempt to address this. First off, I really appreciate the suggestions. I think they are modest tweaks, in the interest of what we've been talking about, of more refinement than anything, but I think they do help to note the different ingredients for different communities and recognizing that the context matters of what it means to be a complete community in different parts of the county. It's not the same in a rural village as it is in an urban activity center, but the concept of being able to live a healthy life with reasonable amenities is something that we should be planning for. I think there's a little bit of confusion of what a complete community is and what 15-minute living is, and whether they're the same thing, whether they're different things. I know there are a lot of concepts that are being thrown around, so I thought it might just be helpful to explain that if Casey or Gwen would be willing to do that. And then I just have a modest suggestion of a tweak to the language in the second paragraph as it was presented on page 15. But maybe we could start with explaining complete communities and 15-minute living and what that means and what's intended there and what it perhaps doesn't mean and how they are either the same or different.
Yeah, I direct your attention to circle 16 and 17 in the packet where this text appears in the draft plan. And that's where we try to clarify what are complete, not just to define complete communities of 15-minute living, but to explain how these ideas are being applied. So you see there at the bottom of 16, where it talks about how complete communities are about creating places that have a variety of uses, amenities, infrastructure, services that serve the needs of a wide variety of people. So it's not just a question of, do you have a grocery store and a barber shop and a doctor's office and all the things we talked about before, but do you have a range of housing types to serve people at different income levels, for example? So everything is not, so we're trying to create neighborhoods that are economically, socially, economically, and racially integrated. And this is one of the things that is a way that we can support that. And that's one of the ways this ties back to equity. And there's some more discussion there, obviously, about how this is going to, as we discussed before, it's not the same thing in any two places, but it's a way of thinking about how you want to organize centers of activity to be as diverse as possible in every sense of the word. And then the next paragraph talks about how the related concept of 15-minute living, honestly, that's something that's sort of fashionable in planning circles right now to talk about 15-minute living. I think all over the world, in fact, the mayor of Paris is really into this idea. But the point here is not, as the plan says, a literal or rigid application of that idea isn't going to work, because there's people in Montgomery County that would take more than 15 minutes to walk to the end of their driveway. So obviously we don't mean that everybody's going to live within 15 minutes walk of all the things they need to do. But when we're thinking about planning centers of activity, we want to plan them to the greatest extent possible with that idea in mind. So it's an organizing way of thinking about how you're going to do a plan for a specific place. You can ask yourself, does this plan create conditions that facilitate more things being within a 15-minute walk of more people? If the answer is yes, then that's an indication we're sort of moving in the right direction. If the answer is no, then that indicates maybe we should rethink things and go back to the drawing board and say, what's a way that we can encourage the introduction of different uses, different activities, different infrastructure, different services, different lot sizes and housing types, so that we can come closer to being a complete community by viewing it through that sort of lens or organizing principle that we're trying to go towards 15-minute living for more people. It's not to say that everybody lives within 15 minutes of everything, but it's a way of thinking about how you're putting together a plan so we can we can move in that direction, even though we know we're not going to achieve that in a county with 504 square miles of land area.
Appreciate that. I just think it's important. A lot of people are talking about what that means, and I think it's important for people to understand that's an example of an aspirational goal, and it's not the same for every community. In some communities, that could be access for a 5 or 10 minute drive to or walk to a full service 24-hour grocery store. To some people, it could be a once a week market, to get fresh produce. The context there, obviously does matter, and I think it's important for everybody to recognize that, it's again an aspirational goal. Reflecting that, I just had one modest tweak to the language. If we go on page 15, the different ingredients for different communities paragraph in the staff packet. It starts the combination of strategies that can help create a more complete community in any particular place depends heavily on context. And then it goes on to talk about the scale, village versus town center versus downtown, location, inside versus outside the growth footprint, and type of neighborhood, and then goes on from there. In the location portion, inside versus outside the growth footprint, and I would just recommend that we add in and within one of the state's 4 growth tiers, which is a reference to sewer envelope, just that is important context as we make those determinations. It's just a very modest suggestion, although I think it's an important one of just the context of the appropriate level of land use patterns and the intensity of growth. Is just something that I think ought to at least be referenced here.
How that area is situated within the sewer envelope, the state's sewer envelope categories, basically.
Exactly. So, which is part of the growth question. I think it's just a mention of that. It doesn't dictate what is done. It just says that it's an important factor.
It's a variable or a factor. It's an element
that ought to be considered as we make determinations. And so then when we do master plans and when we look at those decisions, that'll be something that we consider and something that we think about, which is something that I believe we already do and already should be based on our other policies. I just think it's consistent with what we've already done. So I just wanted to propose we do that. I don't know if there's any view from council staff and from planning.
It's fine. Yeah. I think it's consistent with what has already been looked at by planning, and actually they reference the state growth tiers in the plan as something that the state requires of general plans and master plans to do. So I think it's consistent.
Yes.
Sounds good to me as well.
Thanks. Are you finished?
Yeah, that's all I have on this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just briefly go back and at least ask staff to come up with some language that we could look at a future session for the first chapter in the metrics section around generation of clean energy. I think that's an important land use development planning goal that we know is central to our environmental resilience and numerous goals. So it'd be nice if we could have that as a kind of metric as well.
Absolutely.
So that would go alongside the recommendation that we had for the alternative clean energy generation.
I think so. Although
that was in the policy portion and not in the metric portion. So I just want to clarify to make sure I'm understanding.
Yep.
I think it would make sense if we're adding to the policy that we also
Measure
include something in the measures and metrics
Correct.
that reflects that policy add. I just wanted to clarify that, make sure I'm understanding and that everybody understands. It would mirror what we've already done in adding that to the policy piece. And
as always, your understanding is quite accurate. Thank you. Okay. Continuing.
So as I mentioned, the practices and policies for the chapter 2, I can read through them all. Council staff was in support of the ones put forth by the planning board, as I am with the metrics. And so unless there's questions on those, pretty much are covered chapters 1 and 2.
If I could just briefly, just want to thank you, Pam, and the planning board I really think the metrics had a really good feature. And I appreciate the chair's explanation of complete communities. I think if you ask most people, and I know you did this through a lot of your events, like what do you want to see out of your community? Being able to do everything in and near and around your community, which is really what this complete communities is about. So I think, and just want to say those two things. I think this is the right way to move forward, and appreciate the metrics and the goals and the updates there. So thank you all for your work on it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's been a little bit of, I think people have interpreted the 15-minute thing a little bit too stringently. We're trying to ensure that people have access to the basic amenities, the quality of life amenities with a reasonably short trip. I live pretty darn close to downtown Silver Spring, and it's still not a 15-minute walk for me, to get to a restaurant. It's probably 20 minutes. So I think we understand there's some realism here, and that different modes of travel are relevant. But philosophically, we want people to be able to take shorter trips to get what they want. I think that's the real goal: is shorter trips to live a full life. Okay, great. All right, well, thank you, Pam. Very good. Thank you to the planning board, planning staff.
Sorry, one more thing. I know that in the beginning of the staff report, we mentioned that we really are ambitious to try to have these as weekly work sessions with the committee. We do have the next, actually 4 weeks are set up with us to come to you with some piece of Thrive. We won't be covering chapters 3 and 4 next week. We are in the midst of writing those staff reports now, but they aren't going to be ready to be posted by Wednesday. You may receive a fiscal impact statement before next week, in which case we may be able to have a brief discussion of that. The committee does have 2 other items for next Monday. So if you get something on Thrive for next week, it won't be as complete as a staff report on chapters. And it may be some time set aside for the fiscal impact statement, and we'll just have to update the agenda online accordingly.
Okay. I'm not going to show I will show my hand. This is a vision document. The idea of a fiscal impact statement, I think, is a little bit of a misapplication here. We're talking about ideas, and I wonder what we'll get as a fiscal impact statement here. But I'm not overly concerned about doing a fiscal, analysis of a philosophy. We do that through our master plans. That's when it's relevant. But okay, Andrew.
Yeah, Councilor Jawando was noting it earlier. I just wanted to thank council staff, thank planning staff, thank the planning board chair and planning board. A lot of work has happened since the last time we met. I just wanted to express appreciation for that. I think we're moving in a really positive direction here. There's some additional refinement, some tweaks, some action items that we're going to take from this meeting, which I appreciate the indulgence on some of the things that I've expressed in the maps and others. But I do feel like we're heading in a positive direction, and I think we're are moving in a way that is clear to understand for the public. And so I just want to express appreciation for that. I know that there's been a tremendous amount of work to get us there from where we ended in July to where we are today. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, and look forward to continuing the conversation as we move through this process.
Yeah, agreed. And this is going the way that I expected it to go. There's been quite a few outcries along the way, but I think, I'm not surprised that we're on a smooth path here, and we'll work our way through and we'll get this done.
We've still got some hot topics to come. So
we do. I mean, this was a surprisingly easy one. I will admit. So we'll see what the next chapters have in store for us. Okay. Well, that concludes this item. We have another item, but thank you, Pam, and thank you to Casey and Gwen and everyone involved. And we'll keep working away on this. Now we're going to take up the International Green Construction Code. Hello, Lavu.
Hello,
How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
All right. So we have received this IGCC update, and we got it kind of right during budget and didn't really have the ability to take it up then. But so we had to have an extension. But we're going to review this briefly, and then we can move it along and get it approved so that we don't have to file an additional exemption or extension, or allow it to go through without the council's approval, which I don't think we want to do either of those. So I'll turn it to you, Ms. Dindu, to talk about community feedback we received as you walk through the document. But I will say my general understanding here is that there's been a more consensus around this one, certainly than the last one. The last time we did it, there was we had to do a lot of conversation, and they built some important policy provisions into it, and I don't foresee that those are issues this time around. But let's talk. So welcome back, and thanks for your work preparing today's material.
So I want to start by saying that we have Brian Bomer here from DPS, who did a lot of the work on this before it got sent over to County Council. So he'll be here if we have any questions, particularly ones that I can't answer. So to go over the procedure a little bit, so this is a method 2 regulation, which means the council does have to approve or disapprove it as a whole. So there aren't going to be any amendments. It's sort of a yay or nay. So we took an extension in May, so the council has till September 28th. So this is actually scheduled for a work session and action next week, so the council can make a decision on it before that deadline passes. Otherwise, we do have to file another extension. So I'll do a little background first on what the IGCC is. So it's the International Green Construction Code. Basically, the way the International Building Council says it is that buildings account for about 12% of water use, 40% CO2 emissions, 65% waste output, 70% electricity consumption. So for all those reasons, doing green buildings is a great way to help the environment. As I said, it's developed by the International Code Council, and then various local jurisdictions can decide whether to adopt it as a whole or to adopt it with some amendments. And so the executive regulation we received from the county executive has those proposed amendments. And what it does is it regulates the construction of both new and existing buildings. And so, as mentioned, the 2012 one was a lot more controversial. This one only has a few changes to the 2012 one that the council had adopted. And so the first way it differs is it incorporates the technical requirements of the OSHRA standard, which was basically a model code that had minimum requirements and used to be an alternative compliance path. So now that's been more fully incorporated into the 2018 IGCC. As background for people who don't know, an alternative compliance path basically provides additional options or approaches to LEED credits. And LEED credits are what developers use as a sort of green building rating system. And it's 4 tiers, and you get credits based on how sustainable your building is. Other features of the 2018 versus 2012 is there are new provisions for vegetation and roofing systems. Water use has gone from prescriptive to mandatory. There's requirements to track and assess energy consumption. There's changes in lighting requirements, and there's higher requirements for indoor moisture control. So while there wasn't a public hearing before the full council, there was a public hearing, and that was in September 2020. The date to submit written comments, I believe, was till early October, and DPS received a lot of written comments. Those comments are actually included in your packet. So if you go towards the end of the attachment of the executive regulation, you can see all those comments. DPS responded to all of them, and then quite a few are actually incorporated into the suggested amendments. So I will move now to those amendments. I'm going to go chapter by chapter. I think that's the easiest way to do it. So starting with chapter 1, which is the scope and administration. of the IGCC. One amendment proposed is to apply it to new buildings that are greater than 5,000 square feet. The reason is this will exempt most residential buildings, so single family homes, townhomes, really small businesses. And then the other change to chapter 1 is it removes a reference to a Board of Appeals, just because the county, we have a different process with our Board of Appeals. Chapter 2 is reserved, so I'll skip that one. Chapter 3 is definitions, abbreviations, and acronyms. So the executive regulation adds a definition for gross aggregate area, and it also amends the definition for owner's project requirements by basically adding an additional requirement to certify certain documents. Next up is chapter 4, which is also reserved. Chapter 5 is site sustainability. So this is the thing you'll notice a lot in the executive regulation. A lot of the proposed amendments are actually deleting a lot of sections. Usually the reason is actually because it's something that's already covered by another department, or specifically because of where this is in the county code. Everything the executive regulation adopts has to be something that DPS can enforce. So some of the provisions in the original IGCC just aren't enforceable by DPS. So this section, or so for chapter 5, some of the select sections that are deleted are about development activity, pre-design, site and inventory assessment, plants and invasive species, stormwater management, light pollution, transportation, site waste management. And as you can tell from those lists, those are a lot of the things that planning department actually reviews when they're looking at applications. And so since they already have all those different thresholds based on the size and the scope of the project, it's not really necessary, and it would probably conflict to adopt the IGC's provisions. Also, the county has a really robust stormwater management program. So you'll notice for the most part, we're not adopting the IGC provisions, and ours complies with FEMA and also works. And then also,
Pam, I'm sorry, maybe that's because ours accomplishes more protection than the International Green Code, right? I mean, our stormwater achieves more, it's more stringent, right?
yes, that is true.
I think that's something that's not, people think that, I think it's a surprise to people that we do more than most jurisdictions with a lot of these issues. I was just actually on a podcast who said, oh, you're telling me that stormwater issues in Montgomery County are different from other jurisdictions? It's like, yes, by a long shot. It's not well understood, but okay, great, thanks.
And actually the next one is site waste management, which is another one that the county just does differently. In the IGCC, it's about sort of building construction, so things like vegetation and debris. And in the county, we actually try to recycle a lot of that material and don't have a prohibition on that debris going to landfills. Next is chapter 6, which is water use efficiency. So this chapter has been deleted in its entirety. And the reason for that is in the county, it's WSSC who controls all the water supply and plumbing. So that's not a DPS task. And chapter 7, which is energy efficiency, actually has the most changes. And that's because of a lot of updates made to the formulas and tables that are in chapter 7. One thing is renewable energy credits are going to need to be obtained through the PJM interconnection region. And that's basically a regional organization that coordinates the movement and selling of electricity in this area. So the executive regulation adds that RECs need to go through the PMJ. And then also the updates to the formulas and tables I was referencing, that's because the numbers are actually updated annually. And as noted, this is the 2018 IGCC. So now in 2020 and 2021, those numbers are different. And so that's why the formulas have adjusted and changed based on that. The next chapter is chapter 8, which is indoor environmental quality. This is another one where it's just not a DPS duty. So the sections on tobacco smoke and property line sound levels are being deleted because those are both regulated by the Department of Environment. Similarly, chapter 9, materials and resources. has a construction waste management. And again, that goes back to what I was saying about the way that the county handles construction waste going to landfills. And then actually the very last chapter, chapter 10, is construction and plans for operation. So the executive actually added in some requirements in terms of documents and what departments they need to go to, and then deleted various sections such as noise pollution, radon, construction waste management, water use efficiency, and transportation, because those are all under WSSC, Department of Environment, or transportation, actually. So to go to some of the comments, you'll see in the packet that DPS specifically replied to almost all of them, but there are some bigger ones that came up a few times that I wanted to bring up. First is that idea that there are things that we're not adopting, so it looks like, oh, why didn't we adopt these? And it's because in many of those cases, we already accomplished those goals and possibly are actually even more stricter in terms of the environment. The second issue is obviously the climate action plan is something that's ongoing right now. So I just wanted to note that this does not conflict with the climate action plan in any way. It's actually complementary, mostly because the IGCC establishes a lot of different thresholds and performance standards and gives you those exact numbers. So those two things shouldn't conflict, because I know there were a few comments about why do this one first or not the other one first. There's also a pending bill right now on green building performance, and it does not conflict with that bill either. So this shouldn't affect any of the other climate actions that the county is taking right now. And then lastly, there were a lot of comments about the alternative compliance path. So this is kind of a hot topic. Basically, is allowing an alternative path giving developers an out, or is it just making it more flexible? DPS actually has its own alternative compliance path process, which is also attached in the packet, and it is very strict, and it makes sure that we're still being just as sustainable while allowing developers to accomplish those same goals, just in different ways that are specific to their project. So that is a very quick overview of the IGCC.
Terrific. All right, Brian, thanks for all your work. Really appreciate it. No, this is a huge topic. So is there anything you'd like to share with us?
No, just looking forward to getting this thing moving forward.
All right. That's what I like to hear.
Well said.
Okay. Well, good work getting this smoothed out so that when it came here, it was something we could just easily sign off on and get it moving, as you said. So let's make Brian happy. Any other comments from my colleagues? All right. Without objection, committee approves the proposed IGCC update. Okay, and I think we need to get it on, as you know, the calendar pretty quick so that we get it done in time.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you. Glad we got that done, and thanks to Stan Edwards and team for bringing that to my attention. Appreciate it, and thank you, LeBou. Appreciate your work.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you.
We are adjourned. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care.